Hello, everyone. It's very sunny here in New Jersey. Welcome to week 7. We're going to be talking about intractable conflicts, mediation, and ripeness. We're at this point, we're going to start moving from analyzing the various aspects surrounding a conflict, the history, the people involved, the issues and the interests and the positions. And we want to start looking at what are some of the steps that could be taken in bringing a conflict closer to peace. And I'm going to be presenting this, but please understand that none of this is one size fits all. What works in one country doesn't work in another. What works in one time period doesn't work in a later time period. And plus, we just don't have enough time to cover all the variables. This is just some things to start thinking about as we are looking at a particular conflict. What could be possible and what could be recommended or tried. We're going to be looking at what's called intractable conflicts and also the various responses to resolving them. Okay, so a lot of today's content is from this book, Taming Intractable Conflicts, Mediation in the Hardest Cases. And I'll be weaving in some specific examples of previous and also ongoing conflicts to help illustrate the points that the authors bring up. And we'll also be looking at the concept of ripeness and how that applies to mediation. First, a definition. Some scholars and those who practice mediation or conflict resolution will use the term intractable conflicts to mean those that can never be resolved or even effectively managed. Others will take the view, including the authors of this book, that these conflicts, they may be stubborn, but they're not impossible to manage. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. There can be, and there is some hope. Typically, in a conflict, the various parties will look toward coming to a settlement or become more open to negotiation when the costs of continuing the conflict outweigh the benefits, right? It's becoming too costly in terms of money, in terms of human lives, and there are fewer and fewer benefits to continuing. Then they look for a way out. This can happen for many reasons. Maybe the leadership changes. Maybe the public becomes too weary of the violence and the citizens start pushing for peace. The loss of life or the loss of the damage to property becomes too high or too unbearable, or many other circumstances may change. Maybe there's greater international pressure. However, in an intractable conflict, this weighing of costs and benefits of fighting doesn't really happen. The leadership of the conflicting parties are not interested in the alternatives to fighting because the fighting is not hurting them enough. If the elites, especially the elites in leadership positions of these fighting parties, if they are not losing because of the fighting, they're less likely to push to end fighting, to look for peace. A large number of the population, especially those with influence, may be benefiting from the conflict. And in intractable conflicts, there are much more complex, entangled, and entrenched interests of each side, which they are unwilling to compromise on. We can think of a few examples of intractable conflicts: Israel-Palestine, North and South Korea, India and Pakistan, over the region of Jammu and Kashmir, the DRC, Sudan, Venezuela, and I'm sure you can think of some examples which could be added to these lists. So let's look a little bit more at the characteristics of intractable conflicts. There are a few important characteristics. Number one is relating to time. These are conflicts which are long-standing, that have been happening for many years or even for decades. The authors say that as a consequence, they are conflicts where psychological wounds and a sense of grievance and victimization runs very deep. These are conflicts that remain unresolved, even if there have been many attempts to resolve them from outside influences, even from the UN or other mediators. Those have failed and they return to fighting. Another characteristics of intractable conflicts is relating to the violence that we see. There are either bursts of violence or conflicting parties don't formally leave a danger zone. And renewing violence could be very likely. Looking at the long-range view, long-term view of an intractable conflict, there may be periods of like hot fighting where they're actively going to war, dropping bombs on each other, their military hostilities. And then there can be shorter periods of violence at lower levels, but they keep coming back. It keeps recurring, even if there's a period of it looks like peace, but tensions are high. It could outbreak at any time. Or an intractable conflict could be a situation where there is a technical end to war, such as with North and South Korea, but there is no formal peace and no formal peaceful diplomatic relations. Another characteristic is in terms of the interest in resolution. In any conflict situation, a third party will have to make a lot of effort to bring the conflicting parties to the table. That's just the nature of the role, since it's very difficult for conflicting parties to discuss and agree on a settlement face to face. So that third party helps bring them to the negotiating table. But in an intractable conflict, it is especially difficult to bring the parties to the table because those parties are maybe not seriously considering the options that would lead to an end of the state that they're in right now. Just for an example, North Korea again, it has joined negotiations periodically over different time periods, but many times it has done so in service to its own interests. I strongly doubt that North Korea has serious intentions to denuclearize, for example. But it's very difficult to come to any kind of agreements that would make a significant change on the peninsula. Or in any intractable conflicts, there may be little interest in trying to resolve the conflict because in the past, the efforts to bring a settlement were unsuccessful or disappointing. And then a fourth characteristics that we could point out is in terms of political extremists. Intractable conflicts often have political extremists on all sides of the dispute who would dictate the terms of any potential resolution. These extremists might see that the only end to the conflict is the complete annihilation of the other side, or those extremists are very rigid and unwilling to make any concessions which would favor the interests of the other side. You could say that there's a lot of this political extremism happening right now in the last few years between Israel and Palestine, or even further back, but I'm just focusing on most currently. For example, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, his stance on the war in Gaza throughout 2025 has been to achieve what he calls "quote unquote" total victory. And most recently, as of recording this video, there was a ceasefire that was instated in October 2025 as part of a US-backed peace plan. Actually, I'm saying this and writing this, just days after the attack on Iran collaborated between the US and Israel. Anyway, we'll see how things turn out. But already in that ceasefire, that October 2025 agreement, there were so many difficulties, there were violations, and you still feel like fighting could break out any day. Israel demands that Hamas disarm, otherwise they're going to start the war again. Hamas refuses until Israel leaves Gaza. It goes back and forth, and neither side is willing to make concessions because of their long history and those deeply entrenched grievances and the things that they hold against each other. There are some factors which can contribute to intractability. Leaders have a vested interest in the conflict continuing, either because of political power or personal wealth or both. Leaders can also fear for their safety if a war should end. Second, spoilers can also contribute to intractability. Those outside parties who have a vested interest in the conflict continuing and have a capacity to derail any peace negotiations. There could be a lack of positive outside influences. This is something like access to external partners or third parties who could play a mediating role. If there are no outside actors with a strong enough interest in helping to resolve the conflict, then the conflict can remain unresolved for a long period of time. If parties have tried to find a resolution but failed in the past, this can also contribute to the ongoing intractability of the conflict. The parties expect failure because that's what happened before. So it makes it much harder for them to have an open discussion. And if citizens have very little means to influence or control armed parties, this can also contribute to intractability. This can be very likely in regions where there's extreme poverty. When you're living just hand to mouth, you don't have the capacity, as much capacity to organize with each other and, have an organized movement against the government against the decision makers who go to war or continue the conflict. And it's a vicious cycle. And I just hope it's clear to you that when we're talking about intractable conflicts, it's nearly impossible for the parties of the conflict to come to a resolution on their own. There's so many factors that get in the way. So for a variety of reasons, they need the help of a third party, of a mediator in many cases. There are cases of conflicts in the past which had seemed impossible and intractable, where a mediator was able to help bring a resolution. First, I wanted to take a look at how do third parties typically respond to these types of difficult and complex conflicts. First is just to let it burn. There will be some who think this is the best course of action. It sounds terrible, but the argument is that why should we get involved with these parties which are not even interested in finding a peaceful resolution? Maybe it's best just to wait until that point when the costs outweigh the benefits of fighting, or the best resolution is a complete victory of one side over the other. And this is less and less likely to happen, this kind of like naive thinking nowadays, because the characteristics of modern warfare. Because of globalization, even small groups, those small armed groups which are fighting against a larger and powerful government, maybe they are less isolated because they can have more friends, they can have more connections because of the internet, because of technology, and then they can have access to resources that help them to sustain or reopen conflicts. A clear example of this would be the cases of the so-called conflict diamonds, also known as blood diamonds, during the very brutal civil war in Sierra Leone from 1992 to 2002. They could be sustained because the Revolutionary United Front rebels were able to control rich diamond fields and sell those diamonds on a global black market and buy weapons to fund their fighting. And the RUF was not particularly large or well organized, but because they had access to global markets, thanks to globalization and external support from Liberia, it was able to maintain its war against the government for a decade. So letting it burn can just lead to more destruction and loss of human life. Another typical response from third parties against these kind of conflicts that come up is to only engage when you have to. This is similar to letting it burn, but the argument is that those powerful countries like the United States who take a role as a mediator or intervenes in conflicts, they should only engage in areas which are of highly strategic importance. If it is a matter of foreign policy or the intervener's national security, then you intervene. Intervening in conflicts around the world takes a huge amount of resources and resolve. So, don't only engage when you have to, only when it matches your national interests. That's the argument. However, there are also challenges to this perspective. There, of course, is the moral objection. Personally, I think when people are suffering, it's terrible to say which is more deserving of help than others. But also conflicts that are left alone can potentially become breeding grounds for groups which can cause even greater harm in the future. An example of this is prior to 9/11, Afghanistan was not of high strategic importance to the United States for many years. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, which kind of woke up the United States. The US then heavily supported the Mujahideen. These were guerrilla fighters who fought against the Soviet Union. But once the Soviet Union withdrew, the US kind of backed off and not really considering the long-term impact and stability of that country. And this is an example of engaging only when you have to. The strategic interest was over, but this region of Afghanistan became a breeding ground for those violent strains of Islam, which have been able to challenge regional and international stability. Al-Qaeda has direct links to the Mujahideen, and we're interconnected. We're no longer isolated in our own little countries. So choosing to ignore a conflict if it is not strategically important is not always risk-free. It can come down and create even more troubles down the line. A third typical response is to intervene whenever and wherever fighting takes place to the extent possible. This is the approach most common with the United Nations and other international organizations and NGOs. Because of its charter, the UN is under a lot of pressure to engage in if the conflicting parties request help. But the challenge is that United Nations is made up of member states. Engagement requires resources. And so it requires the member states to also be on board and supportive of those interventions. These resources cannot be sufficiently engaged to make a difference if powerful nations like China, Russia, the United States, or others, or the Security Council itself are not on board and not supportive. In the Security Council, if any of the 5 permanent members, that is China, Russia, France, the UK, and the US, veto a resolution, then the United States cannot be mobilized for a peacekeeping mission. Think back to Syria under al-Assad. Syria was possibly another intractable conflict we could add to our list. Anyway, there was considerable pressure for the UN to act. Assad was essentially acting with impunity, not caring at all if citizens were caught in the crossfire. But consistently, resolutions in the Security Council were vetoed by Russia and sometimes China. So there's a limitation of how much and where the UN can act. Even if the UN became more involved in conflict around the world, its resources become stretched very thin. And there are certainly conflicts where the UN engagement is not sufficient. The UN is engaged, but in order to make a bigger difference, it needs more resources. NGOs will also tend to have this kind of policy to intervene wherever there is need. But this approach sometimes gets criticism. NGOs can be accused of bringing in their help and then leaving when their funding runs out, or their work is disconnected from broader ongoing efforts to bring peace. And, if you have many different parties engaged in what's called track 2 diplomacy, If it's uncoordinated, it can cause problems. Even if the intentions are good, NGOs working on the ground in conflicts, each has their own agenda, and they don't always coordinate well with each other. So that's a challenge. And a final approach of third parties in addressing conflict has been to just leave it to others. If powerful nations, the UN or NGOs, don't or can't intervene, then there's maybe this naive hope that, well, someone will do something, and someone will take on that peace building burden. And of course, the problem is that this mysterious someone doesn't always appear, and the conflicts get forgotten. The conflict itself becomes the status quo. I feel like, when we think about the Middle East, sometimes in our perception, we just think that, well, there's always going to be conflict. And then just that lack of engagement, positive engagement, just helps to reinforce the intractability of the conflict. And it seems like it will never end. As you can imagine, none of these four options are very desirable or sustainable, especially if we are talking about conflicts which there is significant loss of life or suffering of people. This loss and suffering can come in the form of destruction of poverty, destruction of property, poverty, displacement, harm, not just to soldiers, but also to women and children, to citizens, to the elderly, and it's a long list. Personally, I think that a lot of these approaches are rooted in this unconscious acceptance that war, violence, and conflict are just part of our lives. And we hope for peace, but no one could say that they hope for violence and destruction, of course, but how much do we unconsciously think that peace is just a nice dream or an ideal or something that's unattainable? Another part of it, I think, is that even though we are so interconnected with each other because of globalization, we have yet to achieve the mindset of seeing ourselves as a global family or a global community. There are some individuals, certainly, and some organizations that think with that mindset, but at least when it comes to those great powers and top levels of leadership, I still think there's a lot of self-interest for my country, for my people, above others, or thinking that, well, that's not my problem. So none of these approaches are particularly desirable when we're talking about conflict. In Taming Intractable Conflicts, the authors argue that these four approaches are much too laissez-faire. They're naive and too hands-off. Like, it'll take care of itself. It's not going to take care of itself. It's obvious. It's going on for decades. So we need a strategic engagement of mediation in order to shift things for these intractable conflicts. Let me just read this to you from the book. Our own view of the intractability problem is that a laissez-faire approach to these hardened cases of international conflict is neither a desirable option nor ultimately a sustainable one. This is because the parties to an intractable conflict have already amply demonstrated that they are incapable of reaching out to each other and devising negotiable solutions to the issue that divide them. If the parties can't do it themselves, leaving them to their own devices in the hope that negotiations will one day suddenly emerge is the height of wishful thinking. And as we have argued above, letting a conflict fester risks spreading the contagion to others, infecting whole neighborhoods with potentially devastating global consequences. So mediation can be used strategically by nations as an important foreign policy tool and as a best practice for international organizations and NGOs. Strategic engagement through mediation requires careful research, planning, and preparation, clear goals, reaching out to all potential allies and stakeholders, including the spoilers, understanding the regional and international ramifications of intervention, power to make parties seek the costs and benefits of fighting differently. And this kind of power can come through persuasion, through coercion, providing roadmaps and options, sweetening the deal, strengthening confidence in the process. So why mediate? Next week, especially, actually, we'll be going more into the specific tools and role and impact of mediators. But for the rest of today's video, I want to focus on some of the motivations behind mediation. And we'll touch on the important concept of ripeness, or determining whether a conflict is ready to open to negotiations. And what are some of the typical motives? These are important things to be aware of. Usually there's the motivation of the mediator, him or herself, as an individual, but there is also the motivation of whoever is behind that person engaging their services, or sending them into a conflict in that role. For example, if the US intervenes in a conflict, sends a mediator, there is the motivation of that mediator, him or herself, but also of the US government, right? Why did the government decide to become involved in this conflict? So let's look at three major motivations for states or interstate groups to get involved in mediation. And there are often overlaps between these types of motivations. It's not always completely one or the other. So there are humanitarian motives. This is from Taming Intractable Conflicts. A state may undertake the role of mediator for humanitarian purposes in situations where there is a strong public voice and ethical imperative for action to end civilian suffering and forestall further disasters or atrocities, even if the state's strategic interest in the conflict is slight or non-existent. So some of the goals of humanitarian motive are linked to saving lives, establishing safe havens for refugees, demilitarizing certain areas so that relief can come in, or arranging a pause in fighting so that humanitarian relief can come in to help people on both sides. But some of the challenges, there's always challenges, of coming to mediation with this motivation is in some of these conflicts, external actors can have a greater interest in saving lives or helping local citizens than the parties of the conflict. So the external actors have a greater interest in helping people than the parties to the conflict. And in this situation, it can be very easy to get so caught up in the humanitarian efforts that the main agenda of peacemaking can be put to the side, or it gets lost in or distracted by the short-term goal of helping people. Just for example, during the Syrian conflict back in 2016, the US and Russia, though they couldn't agree on more intentional intervention, they did help broker a deal to pause the fighting to allow aid convoys into the city of Aleppo, which was being held by rebel forces, which were fighting against the Assad government. The motivation, of course, is to help the innocent people who are stuck in the city, which was under siege. And certainly some people in the city are sympathetic to the rebels or even aiding the rebels, but most are just caught in the crossfire and they're suffering. This is their home. But the ceasefire eventually broke down. The Syrian military declared war, and in the aftermath, an aid convoy was attacked. A UN and Syrian Red Crescent convoy delivering supplies was struck. Trucks were destroyed. Aid workers were killed, and some civilians were also killed. And then at the time, the UN suspended aid to Syria. And another shortcoming of the humanitarian motive is that if year after year humanitarian service is given, or there are deals that are made or struck in order to allow for humanitarian aid to come in, but still overall the conflict continues, states and organizations can get what's called humanitarian fatigue. For the mediator, if there is humanitarian fatigue, he or she may be facing greater pressure to get a solution very quickly, or there's a rush to, we have to resolve this. We have to end it now. We've been investing so much in this. But then in that rush, the resulting deal might not be sustainable in the long run. Bringing people together, especially after decades of conflict, takes very careful planning and effort. Look at the example of the current conflict in Sudan. Hold on, I thought I had a slide. There we go. It broke out in 2023, the most recent civil war between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support forces. The UN High Commissioner on Refugees estimates that 13 million people have had to flee their homes. Since then, citizens have faced bombings, sexual violence, hunger, and disease outbreaks, and more. Vital infrastructure has collapsed. Basic services like clean water, healthcare, shelter is very limited. It's a huge humanitarian crisis, which also existed before the war broke out. And this is not the first case of conflict in Sudan. And over the years, the United Nations, the African Union have made a lot of effort to end the fighting because so many people are suffering. But there's also a huge humanitarian motive driving the intervention. But on the flip side, one can argue whether the humanitarian aid is helping efforts for conflict resolution or ultimately long-term conflict transformation. There are many accusations that both the RSF and the Sudanese military have diverted or looted aid, despite commitments after mediation efforts to help facilitate humanitarian assistance. Recently, aid workers find it very difficult to get a visa to enter the country. They face a lot of red tape, and some experts say that there's a deep-seated mistrust of international aid workers. Both sides of the conflict may see aid as a resource to help fuel their ongoing conflict. Either they take it directly or it's kind of utilized as a propaganda tool, to bolster support. Like, look, here we are helping the citizens. And both sides are not really interested in helping the intended recipients, critics say. And those people who are suffering the most or have no access to basic needs are not really being helped. It's not at the forefront of those fighting parties. Even some argue that foreign involvement, including the form of humanitarian aid, is only helping to make the conflict worse as both sides are manipulating it to their own ends, which is the third point here. Aid can be misused unintentionally to help fuel the conflict. All that to say that we're not completely discounting the humanitarian motives of intervention, but the pros and cons would need to be weighed by the mediator. We're talking about the perspective of outsiders looking in. If you are a mediator, you're from the outside and you're looking in. So we need to understand the potential pitfalls and what could happen if we're coming in with this humanitarian motive. We have to keep our sights on not just the short term, helping people who are suffering, but also the long term, which is the transformation of the conflict. So it's not going to come up again. There are strategic motives. This is the other major area of motivation for getting involved. This is from Taming Intractable Conflicts. States may become mediators for strategic reasons involving geopolitical relationships or regional security considerations. In such cases, mediation is a method for advancing and defending national or allied interests in a zone of conflict. The logic is that intractable conflict cannot be neglected because it is too volatile. Let's look at a historic example. In 1995, the presidents of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, and Serbia signed the Dayton Accords through the help of the United States as a mediator. And even though there are certainly criticisms about the accords and how they have impacted those countries since then, it's still considered a major diplomatic success. It ended the war, which had been going on for 3 years, and also we haven't seen a major outbreak as seen in the past 30 years ago. The U.S. has had some strategic interests in getting involved. This was during the Bill Clinton administration. Richard Holbrooke was the main mediator. Some of those interests included regional security in Europe. This is areas part of the former Yugoslavia, which broke up after the end of the Cold War and devolved into war and a surfacing of deep-seated ethnic tensions. The US didn't want to see this conflict spilling over into other parts of Europe, where it has key allies and interests. And another strategic interest was to maintain the credibility and unity of NATO. NATO's role in to implement the military aspects of the Dayton Accords was very important, and it was the first major crisis response operation for NATO at the time. So the U.S. had a lot of interest in seeing it being successful for the sake of the credibility of NATO, not just here, but elsewhere and in the future. This is an example where the strategic interests of a powerful nation have a positive impact on a conflict resolution. And the darker side of this motivation is that sometimes there are conflicts that are going on in areas which are not of high strategic interest to those powers which can make a difference. Or sometimes powerful nations think it is a higher benefit to just manage the conflict, keeping things at a low level, not completely resolving them, and that interest of just keeping it the way it is. Don't let it spill over, but we're not really going to try to resolve it and bring peace. That benefit is seen as outweighing the cost of getting highly involved in helping to resolve it. An example of this could be Cyprus. This is an unresolved conflict despite decades of diplomacy and support for negotiations from the US, the UK, the EU, and the United Nations. Cyprus has been divided between Turkish and Greek Cypriots who have differing views on the future of the island. One of the longest running UN peacekeeping missions has been operating in Cyprus since 1964 to prevent further outbreaks of violence. And this situation is yet to be resolved. And it's a major reason is because the United States and other major powers have been more interested in regional stability and relations with Turkey and Greece, because Turkey and Greece have conflicting interests when it comes to Cyprus. Turkey is a key member of NATO. Cyprus, primarily represented by Greek Cypriots as part of the the EU, and so the conflict remains unresolved. The third major area of interest involves regional security and governance motives. Again, this is from Taming Intractable Conflicts. The third party faces neither a strategic nor humanitarian imperative to mediate or undertake other forms of conflict management. Rather, it works for the public good of a settlement for broader reasons, to harvest the benefits of acting and being seen to act in common interest, to enhance its international reputation and standing, to support popular norms related to transparency and good governance, and to combat generic evils, for instance, terrorism, criminal mafias, and failed states that tend to germinate in intractable conflicts. The US, for example, does often intervene or act as a mediator in conflict zones for some of these values, or at least the United States says it does. Like promoting democracy or combating terrorism. And the US does generally have an interest in being seen internationally in this light, but the altruistic motives can be different depending on the different administrations. And practically speaking, the US cannot get involved everywhere. So often the strategic interest do take precedence over these, altruistic, fighting for democracy or freedom and things like that. Of course, the criticism here is what you say or what you may say about why you're getting involved. Is it really for the sake of democracy and saving lives? Or is there some kind of other ulterior motive behind that? Norway has also acted as a mediator in many cases. with a motive to have this role in the international community as a good citizen and a practitioner of humanitarian solidarity. Very briefly, interconnected with all of these motives, mediation can also be connected to politics, foreign and domestic. On the domestic side, for example, the public, interest groups, legislators can take up a rallying cry for their government, for their state to do something about a particular conflict. The challenges that a mediator may face with this is the public often tends to define a conflict in terms of good guys and bad guys. And even if making that kind of distinction, this side is right and this side is wrong, is not very helpful to mediation efforts, because at the end of the day, these two sides still need to work together within the country for the future of the country. And there's also a pressure to get something done quickly from domestic politics when a state decides to get involved in a conflict zone as a mediator. Back home, there's a pressure amongst policymakers, amongst the government to get things moving. Can't just keep it the same because resources are being expended. And there's a lot of fanfare. We see it in the news. Peace deals were signed between this side and that side, and politicians will use it as like kind of a badge of honor and achievement. Whereas we also have to consider and think about the long-term ramifications of the peace deal. It's not just about the fanfare and about signing a paper. We have to also really conscientiously, as a mediator, think about every aspect of a peace deal and how it's going to impact the country moving forward. Why do certain parties decide not to get involved? Historically, the strongest reason has been a tradition of respecting national sovereignty and not intervening in the internal affairs of independent states. Other factors include it can be difficult for outsiders to gain access to a conflict. One or both parties resist interference, or even a neighboring major party can prevent it. Internal politics can be too complex. Third parties can be wary of talking on such, third parties can be wary of taking on such a huge responsibility when things are so complex, because there's more associated costs. It might take longer, more resources are being expended. One of the costs might be if one of the conflicting parties is the government of that state, there's a hesitancy to undercut their authority because of potential consequences. Even if it can honestly be very hard to see the leaders of that conflict in as a valid negotiating partner. We talked about this previously, but there's the failure of previous mediation efforts makes the situation feel more hopeless. So third parties say, we're not going to get involved. There's a track record of failure. The level of violence may seem insufficient. It might sound terrible, but some third parties might feel it's on a small enough level that it doesn't warrant the resources to start a mediation process. There's not as much international push for resolution, or it might want to be one of these forgotten conflicts that are not in the international eye, and states surrounding where that conflict is happening might feel that the conflict is contained enough that, okay, well, we don't need to get involved here. Potential investors might determine that potential interveners may feel that ending a conflict is less important than other strategic objectives. Other objectives take higher precedence than trying to end the conflict. Just for example, North Korea, again, as you can tell, this is probably one of my favorite examples, but the US may not consider going head to head with China over over North Korea as, a high priority. It's better just to keep the relationship the way it is, even if that means the North-South divide is not completely resolved. Or finally, there might be a general feeling amongst outsiders that intervening here is someone else's problem. So why get involved? As you can see, there are many different factors that have to be considered when coming into engaging in a mediation. Unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as we want. We want to help and we want to end the conflict. We have to think about all these various different aspects and more, which I didn't have time to go over. These factors become much more complex when we're talking about these long-standing, deeply ingrained, intractable conflicts, as we are people who care about peace and the important goals of alleviating the suffering of people who are impacted by violent conflict. We do still have to consider all these practical considerations. Even if states, speak of altruistic ideals of standing up for peace or human rights, states are rarely altruistic. They have strategic interests and they are subject to domestic and foreign politics. The UN is also subject to and has had to navigate the strategic interests of states. NGOs, which have a mission to get involved as mediators, tend to have more vision and a mission focused agenda, but they still have to think about the benefits and costs of getting involved. And NGOs are often reliant more heavily on getting appropriate funding. Before I conclude, I want to touch briefly on the concept of ripeness. The theory of ripeness in terms of mediation was especially developed by William Zartman. It is a conflict right for mediation. This is a crucial question for anyone recommending intervention or getting involved as a third-party mediator. I apologize. I think my video is covering the quotation. Let me just close it for a second. Zartman says that the concept of a ripe moment centers on the parties' perception of a mutually hurting stalemate, optimally associated with an impending, past, or recent avoided catastrophe. The other element necessary for a ripe moment is less complex and controversial: the perception of a way out. Parties do not have to be able to identify a specific solution, only a sense that a negotiated solution is possible for the searching, and that the other party shares that sense and the willingness to search too. So an important thing to understand about ripeness is it's not necessarily that the parties are suddenly saying, oh, okay, we're ready now, please send the mediator. But it's a condition that an outsider can observe, who have an interest in being in a mediating role, and notice that those conditions and step in strategically. Third parties can also contribute to helping those parties see that, oh, there may be ripeness here, we may be ready. And these, just to reiterate these two important points that Zartman highlights. Let me get this. Oops, wrong way. There's a mutually hurting stalemate. Both sides are at a stalemate. They cannot completely have victory over the other. It's felt on both sides. It's not just one side or the other. If one side feels like, well, we are in the top position right now, we are on the way to victory, then you probably don't have a mutually hurting stalemate. And second is the perception that there is a way out, that they're not stuck. They don't have a perception, well, that, this is the way it's going to be until one of us wins or dies trying. But they start to think and see that, wait, there is a way out of this situation. The ripeness is all about the perception of the parties. It is entirely subjective, though there can be objective facts which a mediator can point to help shift their perception. And they can start to see that oh, the conflict is ripe. So third parties can help the conflicting parties to recognize the ripeness. They can recognize, wait, there is a way out for us. We don't have to continue perpetually in this endless fighting. Going back to week 1 as an example, to the Mozambique Civil War. In this case, we can see how both parties to the conflict came to this mutually hurting stalemate, and mediators, especially Sant'Egidio, were able to seize that opportunity of ripeness and help the parties to move toward negotiating an end to the war. Neither side could reach a decisive military victory. Neither the government nor the rebel forces, they were at a military standstill, and both sides were weakened militarily and financially drained from trying to fund their war efforts. This was compounded by the fact that at the end of the Cold War, external military fighting for both sides was decreasing. If you recall, this civil war was happening at the end of the 1980s and into the early 1990s. So the Soviet Union had been supporting the government, but that started to go away as the Cold War was ending. And South Africa had been supporting the rebels, but was facing regional pressure to reduce their direct support. So both parties were kind of losing that external support. Civilian suffering had also reached catastrophic levels. There were over 1 million deaths and 5.7 million people were displaced. There was mass starvation, heavy damage to infrastructure, to hospitals and schools. So the mediators had an important role in helping both sides to see that a negotiated settlement could be a way out of the situation. And thanks to that trust that was built by Sant'Egidio with both sides, that they could see that this is something that is feasible. We don't have to be here forever. Even if there is a presence of these conditions, that doesn't automatically lead to negotiations. Sometimes both parties need to be made aware that, oh, okay, there is a way out. We are in a mutually hurting stalemate. Therefore, we need a mediator. We need third-party help. Easily each party could just dig in their heels and become more resistant to mediation. But in this case, both parties, they were able to see that negotiation was preferable to war. So we covered a lot in terms of how, why, and when a third party would decide to attempt a mediation. And next week, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the role of a mediator within the conflict situation, and we'll discuss more there. If you're interested in some extra resources, I'll post it in Canvas, and you could take a look. And thank you.